In part 1 of the Unit 4 notes, we will be covering the wave nature of light and the electromagnetic spectrum. Rutherfords model proposed that all of an atom's positive charge and virtually all of the mass are contained within a nucleus surrounded by negative electrons. This does not explain how the electrons are arranged in the space around the nucleus, or why negative electrons are not pulled into the positive nucleus. It also does not account for similarities and differences in chemical behavior of elements. In the early 1900s, scientists observed that certain elements emitted visible light when heated in a flame, and analysis of that light showed that the chemical behavior was linked to the electron arrangement. To understand this relationship and the nature of atomic structure, we will first study the wave nature of light. Energy is transferred through atoms in waves, and the absorption and emission of light reveals insight into the nature of matter, energy, and atomic structure. On this slide, we have a few important key terms which will help you to understand waves. First up, we have wavelength. The symbol for wavelength is lambda. And wavelength is the distance between points on adjacent waves measured in meters. On our diagram here, we can see that it is the distance from the top of one wave to the top of the wave next to it. The symbol for frequency is nu, which looks a lot like the letter V. This is the number of waves that pass in a unit of time, expressed in inverse seconds, or s to the negative 1, or hertz, which is symbolized by Hz. So frequency is the number of waves that you have which pass within a given unit of time. The amplitude is the height from the origin to a crest, or from the origin to a trough. So it's basically how high your wave is going up from the center point, which we could call the origin. The crest is the high point of your wave. So we can see the crest here in our diagram. And the trough is our low point for the wave. For our first checkpoint question, we are going to be filling in the parts for the wave from the diagram on the previous slide. So you should write this out in your notebook. Okay, first up, we have our amplitude. So remember, that was the distance from our center line to the top point of our wave. We said before that the distance between our waves is considered the wavelength. At the very top of our wave, we have the crest. The line at which the wave is oscillating around is called our origin. And the bottom part of our wave is the trough. Eventually on your unit test, you are either going to have to fill in a diagram like what you are doing here, or you might have to identify the different parts if you are provided with a picture. Sunlight, which is one example of white light, contains a nearly continuous range of wavelengths and frequencies. White light passing through a prism is broken up into distinct patterns of colors which make up the visible spectrum. This pattern is called the continuous spectrum because each point corresponds to a unique wavelength and frequency. Here we have a picture of the electromagnetic spectrum, which you are going to be using for a lot of the problems within this unit. On the top part of the spectrum, we have our symbol for lambda or wavelength, and this one happens to be shown in meters. On the left side of this particular version of the electromagnetic spectrum, we have very long wavelengths. So you can see 10 to the 8th and 10 to the 6th power. And as we move closer to the right side of the spectrum, we have much shorter wavelengths. So 10 to the negative 12th, negative 14th, and negative 16th. On the bottom, we have our frequency, or hertz. On the far left side, we have very low frequencies, so 10 to the 0 power, and as we move closer to the right, we're going to have much higher frequencies. So based on that, you can see that as your wavelength is getting shorter, your frequency is going up. This should make sense because if you have shorter waves, you can fit more of them within a given amount of space or within a certain amount of time. Another thing that is related to both wavelength and frequency is energy. So as I have a high frequency, or as I have more waves, they are able to transmit more energy. If I have a long wavelength, which means not as many waves, that would be considered low energy. Many of the types of electromagnetic radiation that are on this spectrum you should already be familiar with, such as radio waves, microwaves, and infrared. This tiny little section right here, which is expanded upon above, is the visible spectrum. So this is what you're able to actually see. Typically, the visible spectrum has wavelengths which are expressed within nanometers, and you could easily convert between meters and nanometers using the skills that we reviewed back in Unit 1. Our visible spectrum, you can see, goes just beyond 700 to about 400. So our longer wavelengths and low energy light, which is red, could be compared to our short wavelength or high energy light on this side, which would be either violet or purple. A direct relationship is when one variable increases and the other variable also increases, so they move together. An inverse or an indirect relationship is when one variable increases and the other variable decreases. Now for our next checkpoint question, it says, is the relationship between wavelength and frequency direct or inverse? So if you think back to our previous slide, we saw that as we were getting longer waves, our frequency was less. And as we had shorter waves, our frequency was more, because we could fit more waves within the same amount of space. Based on that, we can say that this is an inverse relationship. So you will be expected to be able to classify different types of relationships between wavelength, frequency, and energy. For our next checkpoint question, within the visible spectrum, which color of light has the lowest energy and which one has the highest? Now we know from what is shown here that red had our longest wavelength and purple or violet had our shortest wavelength. Well, long wavelengths are associated with a low frequency and a low energy. So our color with the lowest energy would be red, and our color with the highest energy would be purple or violet. Which type of electromagnetic energy has the lowest energy? Which one has the highest? So now we're looking at the electromagnetic spectrum as a whole. On the low end, we would have electricity because these have the longest waves. And if this was, say, a multiple choice question and you weren't given electricity, you would pick whatever happens to be on the furthest to the left. So it could be maybe radio waves if electricity is not an option. For which one is the highest? That would be the right side, which is cosmic rays. Or if that was an option, you could say gamma rays. Number 3, will the frequency of gamma rays be low or high? So gamma rays are over on this side of the spectrum, which has very short wavelengths. So if the wavelength is very short, that means that the type of frequency would be very high. So gamma rays would have a high frequency. That concludes part 1 of the Unit 4 notes. When we come back for part 2, we're going to be looking at the particle nature of light.